In the year 1863, on the humid lowlands of Charleston, South Carolina, where the Ashley River curved through endless fields of cotton and the air hung thick with the scent of magnolia and decay, 6 men of considerable standing met their violent end in a single night. 6 colonels, each a pillar of Southern society, each a master of enslaved souls, each believing himself untouchable beneath the canopy of Confederate righteousness, were found in the great house of Bellwood Plantation with their throats opened and their blood soaking into imported Persian rugs. The nature of their deaths was not random. The brutality was not senseless. What happened that April morning was the culmination of something far darker than war, far more terrible than any battlefield carnage, something born from the very institution these men had spent their lives defending and profiting from. You are now listening to Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten histories of the slave-holding states, stories that reveal what happens when human beings are granted absolute power over other human beings, and how that power inevitably corrupts, corrodes, and destroys everything it touches. Bellwood Plantation sprawled across nearly 4,000 acres of prime South Carolina land, bisected by tributaries that fed into the Ashley River, its fields producing some of the finest Sea Island cotton in the entire Confederacy. The estate had been in the Rutherford family since 1789, built on the backs of enslaved Africans who drained swamps, cleared forests, and transformed wilderness into agricultural wealth. By 1863, the plantation held 243 enslaved people, their names recorded in leather-bound ledgers with the same dispassion one might catalog livestock. The great house itself stood 3 stories high, white-columned and imposing, visible from the river like a monument to Southern prosperity. Inside, its halls were lined with portraits of Rutherford ancestors, men and women who stared down from gilt frames with the cold certainty of people who believed their way of life was ordained by God Himself. The master of Bellwood in that fateful year was Colonel Marcus Tiberius Rutherford, 47 years old, a graduate of the Citadel, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and a man whose belief in the natural order of racial hierarchy was as unshakable as his faith in the Anglican God. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying temples and a precisely trimmed beard, known throughout Charleston society for his eloquence at dinner parties and his ruthlessness in business. He had inherited not just wealth but a worldview, one that told him the 243 souls on his property were property indeed, divinely placed beneath him to serve, to labor, to exist only as extensions of his will. Marcus Rutherford had married young at 23 to Catherine Pembroke of Savannah, a woman of impeccable breeding whose family tree stretched back to English nobility. Catherine was by all accounts a woman of refined beauty, delicate features, pale skin that seemed almost translucent in candlelight, and dark hair worn in elaborate styles befitting her station. She had been educated in the manner of Southern ladies, which meant she could play piano, speak French, embroider, and manage household slaves with an iron hand disguised in silk gloves. But Catherine Rutherford harbored a secret shame that gnawed at her daily, a failure that in the eyes of Southern society was perhaps the greatest failure a wife could commit. After 24 years of marriage, she had borne Marcus no living children. There had been pregnancies, 5 in total, but each had ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The last attempt in 1859 had nearly killed her, and the Charleston physician who attended her declared she would bear no more. In a society obsessed with lineage, with passing down names and property and blood, Catherine's barrenness was a wound that festered. Marcus, for his part, never spoke of divorce, but his eyes grew colder with each passing year. His visits to her bedchamber ceased entirely after 1860, and he threw himself into the Confederate cause with the fervor of a man seeking purpose beyond the disappointment of his domestic life. When war broke out in 1861, Marcus received his commission as colonel almost immediately, his wealth and standing guaranteeing him rank. But unlike many officers who departed for Virginia or Tennessee, Marcus remained primarily in Charleston, his duties involving the coordination of coastal defenses, the management of supply lines, and the maintenance of order among the increasingly restless enslaved population as news of Union advances filtered south. He gathered around himself a council of like-minded men, fellow colonels and majors, plantation owners who met regularly at Bellwood to discuss strategy, politics, and the preservation of their way of life. Among this inner circle were 5 men who would share Marcus's fate: Colonel Beauregard Ashton of Ashton Hall, 52, corpulent and red-faced, owner of 300 slaves, and known for his particularly cruel overseers. Colonel Nathaniel Wickham of Wickham Farms, 41, a former attorney, with cold gray eyes and a reputation for legal maneuvering that kept his slaves in perpetual debt bondage. Colonel Preston Fairfax of Moss Grove, 39, handsome and charming in public, whispered to keep several enslaved women as concubines. Colonel Edmund Carlisle of Riverside, 55, a fire and brimstone Presbyterian, who justified slavery through Scripture and beat his slaves after Sunday services, and Colonel Silas Montgomery of Twin Oaks, 44, a widower with 3 legitimate sons fighting in Virginia, known to father children with enslaved women and sell them downriver before they came of age. These 6 men formed what they called the Charleston Defense Committee, meeting twice monthly at Bellwood, though their discussions ranged far beyond military matters into the realm of maintaining racial control, suppressing any hint of rebellion, and ensuring their economic interests survived regardless of the war's outcome. They met in Marcus's study, a room paneled in dark mahogany, dominated by a massive oak desk, and walls lined with books, maps, and a collection of pistols and sabers. They drank imported brandy despite the blockade, smoked Cuban cigars cached before the war, and spoke with the absolute confidence of men who had never imagined their power could be challenged from below. On the plantation itself, the enslaved population was organized with brutal efficiency. There was Big Samuel, 58 years old, the head driver, a man whose own survival had depended on enforcing his master's will, his body scarred from decades of field work, his eyes holding the terrible knowledge of what compromise with evil required. There was Delilah, 34, who worked in the great house as lady's maid to Catherine, light-skinned and silent. Her mother had been one of the previous master's victims. Her own daughter had been sold away at age 12. There was Moses, 27, a blacksmith of extraordinary skill, whose hands could shape iron, but were shackled by invisible chains more binding than any metal. There was Esther, 19, recently brought from a neighboring plantation, her youth and beauty making her a target for the overseer's attention. There was Daniel, 42, a carpenter and lay preacher who held clandestine prayer meetings in the quarters, his faith a mixture of Christianity and African traditions, his sermons speaking of Moses leading his people to freedom. There was Grace, 16, who worked in the kitchen, granddaughter of Big Samuel, her eyes watchful and intelligent, already learning to hide her thoughts behind a mask of servility. There was Isaiah, 24, a field hand with a rebellious streak, who had been whipped twice in the past year for alleged insolence, his back a map of scars, his hatred barely concealed. And there was Ruth, 51, a midwife and healer who knew the secrets of roots and herbs, who attended births and deaths, who held the community's memory and pain in her weathered hands. The event that set in motion the Bellwood Massacre occurred on a February evening in 1863, during one of the Charleston Defense Committee's meetings. The 6 colonels had dined well on roasted duck, sweet potatoes, rice, and pecan pie, served by Delilah and 2 other house slaves, who moved through the room like ghosts, present but invisible to the men who discussed them as if they were not there. The conversation had turned, as it often did after sufficient brandy, to matters of reproduction and legacy. Beauregard Ashton complained loudly about his own wife's failure to produce a male heir, having borne him only daughters. Edmund Carlisle, pontificated about the biblical imperative of seed and harvest, making barely disguised references to his own practice of impregnating enslaved women to increase his human property. Silas Montgomery laughed about his success in that regard, noting that several of his best field hands were his own blood, though of course they carried no legal recognition of paternity. It was then that Preston Fairfax, emboldened by drink and the camaraderie of men who shared his moral universe, made a jest that would prove fatal. He turned to Marcus and said something along these lines, that surely with 200 slaves at Bellwood, Marcus might solve Catherine's failure through alternative means, that Southern gentlemen had been doing so for generations, that blood was blood even if it flowed through darker vessels. The room fell silent for a moment, the other men uncertain whether the boundary of acceptable discourse had been crossed. But Marcus, his face flushed with brandy, and perhaps the raw wound of his childless marriage, did not immediately reject the suggestion. Instead, he stared into his glass and said something that Delilah, standing against the wall with a silver tray in her hands, would later recount to others in the quarters. He said that perhaps Providence worked in mysterious ways, that a Rutherford by blood would carry the line forward regardless of the vessel, and that desperate times called for unorthodox solutions. What began as drunken philosophizing hardened over the following weeks into something far more sinister. Marcus Rutherford, Catherine Rutherford, and the 5 colonels of the Defense Committee entered into a pact that exemplified the absolute corruption that slavery enabled. The precise details of their agreement were never written down, for obvious reasons, but what happened next made the nature of their conspiracy clear. Marcus would select strong, young enslaved men from his own plantation and those of his colleagues. These men would be brought to Bellwood under various pretexts. They would be made available to Catherine Rutherford in circumstances that stripped them of any agency or choice. The goal was simple and monstrous: to produce a white child in appearance if possible, who could be passed off as Marcus's own, thus securing the Rutherford line and Catherine's position in society. The child would be raised as legitimate, would inherit Bellwood, and the biological father would be none the wiser, likely sold away, or worked to death before questions could be asked. The 5 colonels agreed to participate by providing their own enslaved men for this purpose, creating a pool of potential fathers that would obscure paternity. In exchange, they would share in the legitimization of the practice, each perhaps harboring thoughts of applying similar solutions to their own domestic problems. It was eugenics, rape, and human trafficking, disguised as aristocratic ingenuity, and it was made possible only because the enslaved were not considered fully human, not granted bodily autonomy, not afforded the protection of law or morality. Pause for a moment, and reflect on what such an arrangement reveals about the corrupting nature of absolute power. These were not monsters from fairy tales. They were educated men, church elders, military officers, fathers and husbands, who read poetry and discussed philosophy. Yet slavery had so thoroughly warped their moral compass that they could devise such a scheme without apparent internal conflict, could reduce human beings to stud animals, could collaborate in the systematic rape of enslaved women and the forced breeding of enslaved men, all while maintaining their positions in polite society. This is what slavery did. It turned human interaction into property transaction, transformed intimacy into ownership, made violence banal and suffering routine. The implementation began in March of 1863. Marcus selected Moses the blacksmith first, a man of imposing physical strength and, crucially, lighter skin that suggested mixed ancestry somewhere in his lineage. Moses was summoned to the great house on a Thursday evening, told his skills were needed to repair a lock on the mistress's bedroom door. When he arrived, he was met not with broken hardware, but with Catherine Rutherford in her dressing gown, and Marcus standing with a pistol in his belt, making the threat clear without words needing to be spoken. What happened in that room was rape, though the law of South Carolina in 1863 did not recognize such a crime when the victim was enslaved and the perpetrator was their owner or acting under the owner's authority. Moses emerged an hour later, his face blank, his hands shaking, his soul carrying a new wound that no blacksmith's skill could repair. He was sent back to his forge with a warning that silence was the price of his life. The following week, Isaiah was summoned under the pretext of moving furniture. Then Daniel the carpenter was called to repair a window sash. Then came 2 men from Ashton Hall, brought over under the guise of temporary labor loan. Then 1 from Wickham Farms. Then another from Fairfax's Moss Grove. Over the course of 6 weeks, 10 different enslaved men were cycled through the great house of Bellwood, each encountering the same horror, each carrying the same trauma, each sworn to silence under threat of death or sail to the deep south, which was often worse than death. The enslaved community of Bellwood was not ignorant of what was happening. Delilah saw the men arrive and depart. Big Samuel noticed the pattern of late-night summons. Ruth the midwife heard Catherine weeping in her chambers afterward, perhaps experiencing some vestige of shame or horror at what she was participating in, though not enough to stop. The quarters buzzed with whispered conversations after the overseers retired. Esther held Grace as the girl cried in fear that she might be next, though the plan seemingly focused on male slaves for reasons of easier deniability. The prayer meetings led by Daniel took on a more urgent, desperate character, his invocations of divine justice becoming less metaphorical and more immediate. Moses stopped speaking entirely for days at a time, working his forge in grim silence, his hammer blows ringing out like tolling bells. Isaiah's barely concealed rage became open contempt, and he received a severe whipping in late March that left him unable to work for a week, his back flayed open, his spirit paradoxically hardened rather than broken by the violence. By early April, Catherine reported to Marcus that her monthly courses had ceased, suggesting possible pregnancy. The news spread quickly through the household staff to the quarters. If the plan had succeeded, it meant one of the 10 men was the biological father of what would be proclaimed the Rutherford heir. It also meant those 10 men would likely not survive long enough to complicate the narrative. The 6 colonels of the Defense Committee met at Bellwood on April 10th to celebrate and to discuss logistics. Beauregard Ashton proposed a toast to Providence and racial preservation. Nathaniel Wickham suggested a legal framework for managing similar arrangements in other households, speaking of carefully drafted property transfers and prenuptial agreements. Preston Fairfax made crude jokes about selective breeding. Edmund Carlyle offered a Presbyterian prayer, thanking God for his mysterious gifts. Silas Montgomery discussed which of the men should be sold downriver immediately, and which could be kept on to avoid suspicion, arguing for a gradual dispersal over 6 months. Marcus himself seemed almost giddy, his 24-year disappointment potentially resolved, his family line secured, his masculine pride restored in his own twisted logic. What none of these 6 men knew, what their absolute certainty in their own superiority had blinded them to, was that the enslaved people of Bellwood and the connected plantations had been communicating, planning, and preparing for a response. The network was facilitated by Daniel's prayer meetings, by Ruth's movements as a midwife who traveled between plantations to attend births, by the occasionally permitted visits between enslaved spouses who lived on different properties, and by the river workers who ferried goods and gossip between the coastal estates. The core group consisted of 7 individuals: Moses, whose violation had been first, and whose rage ran deepest; Isaiah, whose rebellious nature found purpose; Daniel, whose faith now demanded action; Ruth, whose knowledge of poisons and herbs made her indispensable; Esther and Grace, who worked in the great house and could observe patterns; and Big Samuel, who shocked everyone by joining the conspiracy, despite his position as head driver, perhaps because he had witnessed too much evil and finally reached the limit of his complicity, or perhaps because his granddaughter Grace had begged him to protect her from being next. They understood that killing Marcus alone would achieve nothing but swift retribution. They understood that the 6 colonels were bound together in their crime and in their power, and they understood that during the Defense Committee meetings, when all 6 men were together at Bellwood, isolated in the study, after dinner, guards drowsy or distracted, the household staff reduced to minimal presence, there existed a window of vulnerability. They also understood this act would likely cost them their lives, but for men and women who had already been stripped of agency, dignity, and humanity, who had watched their children sold, their bodies violated, their spirits systematically broken, the calculus of sacrifice took on different dimensions. Some chose to participate because they had nothing left to lose. Others chose because they believed it might spark something larger, a message to other enslaved communities that resistance was possible. Still others chose because the alternative, continued passive endurance, had become spiritually unbearable. The date selected was April 12, 1863, a Saturday night when the Defense Committee was scheduled to meet at Bellwood to discuss the latest news from the Virginia front and to celebrate Catherine's confirmed pregnancy with a special dinner. The plan was meticulous in its simplicity. Ruth prepared a tincture from pokeweed and jimsonweed, carefully measured to cause severe disorientation and muscle weakness without immediate lethality, since death from poison would invite investigation and possible discovery of the network. The tincture was added to the brandy decanter in Marcus's study by Delilah during her afternoon dusting, the one placed on the sidebar that Marcus only opened for his closest companions. The 6 colonels arrived at dusk, their carriages rolling up the oak-lined drive as the sun descended over the Ashley River, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple. They dined on roasted venison, oysters brought up from Charleston, rice and gravy, fresh bread, and a Charlotte Russe for dessert. They were in high spirits, their conversation animated, their laughter loud enough to be heard in the slave quarters half a mile away. Catherine took dinner in her room, pleading delicate condition, which was accepted without question. After dinner, the 6 men retired to the study around 9 o'clock. Delilah served the brandy and withdrew. Marcus dismissed all house staff for the evening, wanting privacy for their discussion. The household slaves retreated to their quarters behind the kitchen, as was customary. What the colonels did not see was Moses, Isaiah, and Daniel slipping through the darkness toward the great house, having left their own cabins through backways, moving with the practiced silence of men who had learned to be invisible. They were armed with kitchen knives taken from the smokehouse, sharpened to razor edges by Moses at his forge. Big Samuel remained at the quarters, his role to provide alibis and manage any immediate questions about the 3 men's whereabouts. Ruth stayed with the women, ready to treat any injuries if the plan went wrong. Esther and Grace huddled together in their cabin, praying in whispers, their fate now tied to events beyond their control. The poison worked slowly. By 10 o'clock, the 6 colonels were experiencing confusion, blurred vision, difficulty coordinating their movements. They likely attributed it to excessive drink, perhaps laughing about aging and declining tolerance. By 11, several were slumped in their chairs, unable to rise. Beauregard Ashton attempted to call for help, but found his voice slurred and weak. Nathaniel Wickham tried to reach the door, but his legs would not obey. Preston Fairfax vomited into a porcelain spittoon, his face pale and sweating. Edmund Carlyle mumbled prayers, thinking perhaps this was divine judgment after all. Silas Montgomery simply sat staring at his hands, watching them tremble. Marcus Rutherford, sitting behind his desk, felt the room spinning and reached for his pistol, but could not make his fingers grip the handle. It was then, around midnight, that Moses opened the study door. The lock mechanism was one he had forged himself months prior, and he knew its weaknesses. Isaiah and Daniel followed him inside, shutting the door behind them. The colonels looked up with glazed, uncomprehending eyes, seeing three enslaved men, but unable to process the threat, their minds too clouded, their bodies too compromised. In the years after the war, as Reconstruction briefly opened space for black voices to be heard, some accounts of the Bellwood Massacre emerged from the freed people who had witnessed it. A journalist from a northern newspaper interviewed Ruth in 1867, and she spoke carefully about the plantation's conditions, about the system of terror that governed enslaved lives, about the particular horror of those weeks in early 1863, though she never explicitly confirmed the breeding program for fear of legal repercussions that might still reach her community. Her testimony, published in an abolitionist paper, was dismissed by white Southern historians as exaggeration and bias, part of the Northern campaign to demonize the South. Daniel's hymn singing at his execution was remembered and became part of the oral tradition in Charleston's black community, though the reasons for his execution were often obscured or simplified in later retellings. If you have stayed with this story to its conclusion, if you have allowed yourself to sit with its horror and complexity, then you understand something fundamental about slavery that comfortable histories often obscure. It was not merely an economic system, or a regional peculiarity, or a regrettable institution that somehow persisted due to inertia. Slavery was a machine for destroying humanity on both sides of the equation. It granted absolute power to some and stripped all power from others, and that arrangement inevitably produced atrocities. The Bellwood Massacre was not an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a society built on the principle that human beings could own other human beings, that white men could do as they pleased to black bodies, that law and custom and religion would all conspire to protect that power regardless of the moral cost. Consider subscribing to Shadows of the South if you believe these stories must be told, if you understand that comfortable myths about the Old South need to be confronted with uncomfortable truths, if you recognize that history ignored is history repeated. We will continue to unearth these buried narratives, to name the names of both victims and perpetrators, to trace the long shadows that slavery cast across American history and that still darken our present. The 6 colonels who died at Bellwood were not innocent victims of savage violence. They were architects of systematic rape, participants in a conspiracy to reduce human beings to breeding stock, enforcers of a regime that relied on terror, violence, and the threat of death to maintain control. Their deaths were violent and shocking, but they were not more violent or shocking than the routine violence they inflicted daily on the people they claimed to own. Moses, Isaiah, and Daniel were not heroes in any simple sense. They were men driven to an act of extreme violence by extreme circumstances, men who made a terrible choice in an impossible situation, men who understood they were trading their lives for a moment of resistance, for the satisfaction of making their oppressors feel fear, for the slim hope that their action might contribute to the eventual destruction of the system that dehumanized them. Whether their violence was justified is a question each person must answer according to their own moral framework, but what cannot be disputed is the context that produced it, the cascade of crimes that preceded it, the absolute corruption of a society that made such violence seem like the only available response to injustice. Pause and reflect one final time on the legacy of this story. The Bellwood Massacre was remembered very differently by different communities. In white Charleston society, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of slave rebellion, proof of the necessity for harsh controls,
justification for increased violence against black populations during and after the war. In black communities, it became a story of resistance, of men who refused to accept their dehumanization passively, of the price paid for fighting back, of the courage required to face certain death for the sake of dignity. Both memories are incomplete. The fuller truth is that the massacre was neither senseless black violence nor heroic resistance, but rather the inevitable explosion of rage, when human beings are pushed past all endurance, when every legal avenue for justice is closed, when the very people charged with upholding morality and law are the primary perpetrators of immorality and lawlessness. Slavery created the conditions for the Bellwood Massacre. The 6 colonels who died there were killed by a system they championed and benefited from, a system that taught violence as the primary language of power, that made brutality routine and compassion dangerous, that ensured any challenge to authority would be met with overwhelming force, thus guaranteeing that when challenges did come, they would be equally violent in response. The Bellwood Massacre stands as a dark monument to all of this, a story that forces us to confront slavery's moral bankruptcy without flinching, to acknowledge that it damaged not just the enslaved but the slaveholders, not just bodies but souls, not just individuals but society itself. The system that allowed Marcus Rutherford and his colleagues to conceive of their breeding program, to implement it without legal consequences, to celebrate it as a solution to domestic disappointment, was a system that had already destroyed any claim to civilization or morality. The 3 men who killed them were products of that same system, shaped by its violence, limited by its structures, pushed to desperate action by its total denial of their humanity. In the end, everyone involved in the Bellwood Massacre was destroyed.